just want to reiterate some of the important points that we made earlier, or the last point actually, and that is the point about negative pledge. And we had mentioned that, thank you, and we had mentioned that the negative pledge is an undertaking by a government or a borrowing nation not to incur a security that would effectively subordinate the debts of a creditor. The interesting thing to note about a negative pledge clause is that it can apply to both secured transactions and unsecured transactions. And by secured, it means transactions that are collateralized and those that are not. So in any case, a lender could say, we don't want to incur any security, even if we are secured already, because we are afraid that a new security might, for some reason, depending on how you word it, undermine our own security. The next clause that we will deal with is so closely associated with negative pledge. And in fact, there's a sense in which people could mistake both clauses, but they are different, and there's a very important difference. The name of the clause is pari passu. Pari passu is Latin for, yes, it's Latin for in equal footing. There's almost no sovereign loan agreement that the pari passu clause is not included. And lenders include it for good reason. So it is usually a representation and a covenant. And effectively it says that debts would rank pari passu now, and it will rank pari passu throughout the life of the loan. Why does it matter? First, the pari passu clause applies in unsecured loans usually. And so there's no collateral. Français? No? Okay. I think the translation isn't working. Could we please get that fixed for our colleagues who speak French? Ça bon? Oui? Okay. Merci. Okay. So, with pari passu, it applies usually in unsecured transactions where there is no collateral. And so the question that the clause seeks to answer is, if there is no collateral, how do we rank creditors? Who has priority? The lenders want to be sure that because you're not secured and all of them are unsecured in a particular facility, everyone has equality of treatment. So it is equal ranking. I'll take that again. Equality of ranking, not treatment. And that's because this very slight difference led to one of the biggest cases in sovereign debt restructuring, and that was with NML versus Argentina in 2014. And effectively, what the creditors were trying to do was to say, because of the pari passu clause, they were entitled to rateable equal payments. And unfortunately, the courts at the time in New York upheld that argument. But successive courts have reinterpreted that provision to say the courts erred in law when they made that judgment. Because pari passu doesn't mean equal treatment, it means equal ranking. It means all the creditors rank equally, even if they are all unsecured. And so the purpose is to prevent the borrower from subordinating other unsecured lenders. The underlying principle beyond this is a principle in law called the principle of priority. And it says when two equities are equal, the first in time prevails. But when an equity and a legal right coincide, even if the legal right was inured after the equitable rights, the legal right has priority. And I don't want to delve much into that because this is not a law class, strictly speaking, but it's important to understand why lenders emphasize that they must have this clause in the agreements. Please, the clicker. It's not working. Okay. So this is a sample clause for pari passu. It says the borrower shall ensure that its payments obligations under the loan agreement shall at all times rank at least pari passu. When you see pari passu, just replace that with equally or in equal ranking with all its other unsecured and unsubordinated indebtedness. And how do we redefine the pari passu clause, or how do we renegotiate it to make it more borrower friendly? Here, one of the points to note here is to push for external indebtedness. You remember with negative pledge, we also recommended that you push that it is indebtedness that are external and not domestic. Now, I have to tell you that creditors will usually push back on this because they fear that if you exclude domestic debts, there's a concern or there's a possibility that sovereigns would rather settle domestic lenders at the detriment of external lenders. And so there's a chance that you might not succeed with insisting on external indebtedness, but it's worth the try. Yes, so I think I already noted that there. And so another point to note, which you see in the revised clause, we said save as preferred by law. There is a chance or a sense in which certain indebtedness of the government are provided by law. And so a lender does not have the standing to say you must violate your law in order to make us rank equally. So a government, for instance, has priorities, has spending priorities that it must undertake by virtue of its local laws. By including these caveats at the end, to say save as preferred by law, what you're effectively doing is ensuring that ranking does not in any way violate the local laws of the sovereign borrower. And of course, we put external, you can say put that in bold, but also in italics, because it is not a guaranteed exception that can be accepted, but it's worth the try. And so you would recall that both pari passu and negative pledge clauses are covenants. You are effectively covenanting as a sovereign borrower that one, you will not incur any indebtedness that would overtake your existing or that will overtake this particular loan. And second, you are also covenanting that you will not incur any indebtedness that will overtake or that will rank above an unsecured and unsubordinated debts. So the big difference between negative pledge and pari passu is a negative pledge applies to both secured and unsecured transactions or loan agreements, whilst pari passu applies strictly to unsecured loan agreements. And it's trying to put all lenders within that agreement, especially, for example, in a syndicated agreement where there are different lenders under the same facility, to ensure that they are all ranking, so you don't prefer one creditor over another in the same documentation. And so key points to note on negotiating covenants generally. You want to ask and confirm that the carve-outs can be negotiated. For example, I talked about external indebtedness, both for negative pledge, and pari passu. You want to check that you can actually negotiate that. It's worth trying. You can also check, can thresholds be included? And so this is what we do when we are working on what we call the mechanics of the document. We go back and forth with the other side to see if any of our suggestions can fly with that particular creditor. Sometimes, again, as we said, an agreement is an agreement. It's not one party dictating to the other party. And what we're trying to establish with this training is so that the act of lenders often dictating to African governments what they want to see in an agreement can come to an end, because African governments are now more equipped to understand the clauses and how they can also assert their own rights, so that it can actually be an agreement and not a one-sided dictation. So I have an interactive scenario here for us to think about, and it says, imagine a covenant in the loan that says debt to GDP shall not exceed 60%. Now, what happens if gold or oil price collapses or a pandemic blows that ratio to 70%? That covenant would already be breached, even if you are current on payment. This explains the very importance of what we are doing here. So you have a clause, harmless it seems. It says that that your debt to GDP shall not exceed 60%. And then for some reason, COVID-19 happens in 2020, and debt to GDP plummets across many countries. But you're still paying your loan, you're still current on your loan agreement with that sovereign. And somehow, despite being current, you're in default because of this clause. And so we have what we call a technical default, and lenders could accelerate the loan. Is it fair? Is it useful? Probably not. So what do we do when negotiating? Any thoughts? What would anyone here do if you see this kind of clause and you're negotiating this clause? How would you handle this? For want of time, I would just say first, if I'm looking at this document or an agreement with this clause, I will strike it out and I'll write a long comment explaining how particularly useless this is or infeasible this is. Because you can't determine what happens in the world. You can't determine market prices. You can't determine if a pandemic hits. You can't determine if a natural disaster happens, if there's a humanitarian crisis. Any number of things can affect your GDP. You don't want this in your agreements. They could come back and say, no, we insist that you have this because we usually include it. And at that point, if we've gone through maybe 1 or 2 rounds of negotiation, I would include carve-outs. Carve-outs like this would not be triggered in events like a natural disaster, in a pandemic, in unforeseen commodity crashes globally. You indicate thresholds that would ensure that things that are outside the control of any reasonable governments would not trigger this clause. Okay, so there's a covenant here, for example, that says the borrower shall not create or permit the creation of any lien or security. This is so broad and so unhelpful. So what it's effectively saying is that you cannot do anything about your assets in order to secure a loan without, in contravention of the agreements. Any government that signs an agreement with this clause cannot validly borrow and collateralize without breaching these agreements. And so, as we discussed, one of the things that you want to ensure that is in your agreements is a materiality threshold to define or redefine what a lien is, and that it should only relate to external indebtedness, and then you should add carve-outs that effectively says this will not apply when it comes to a a revenue-generating project finance transaction, or central bank reserves. We discussed this already, talking about negative pledges. Okay, so project-specific revenues, liens required by law, international financial institutions for development purposes. I would also add central bank reserves will not be implicated. I'll give you a second to look at this. And, if anyone has any other things that's, propping up in your heart as you are reading this, it's entirely okay to say, what, lawyer, I also have an idea. I think we should add this, and that's fine. Here is another covenant, and in the interest of time, you would get the slides, and then you would see what is revised and what was changed. This is a very ridiculous clause, by the way. It says, the lender shall have the right to inspect and audit all books, records, and accounts related to the use of proceeds at any time upon 3 days business day priority notice. And the borrower shall be responsible for all reasonable costs and expenses incurred in connection therewith. There's a question in front here, please.
I remember in South Africa we have this statutory statement in our law that say any money that the government borrow forms a first claim against the National Revenue Fund. So the whole tax base protects any borrowing. Is that not enough?
So the law says that any borrowing the government makes has first claim over the national revenue.
Fund. So
revenue
before
fund.
government pay any salary or other commitments, it must first, in a situation where it happens, shall first honor its commitment in terms of its debt.
It's a very interesting provision, very creditor-friendly. And so South Africa will likely have or be able to get cheaper loans compared to other countries because that law effectively gives creditors confidence that they have priority in your country, even over, from what you've described, over domestic like salaries and what the government needs to do to run its government efficiently. I'm not sure the motivation behind couching a clause or couching a law like that, and I don't know if there are any exceptions or caveats to that law. I would imagine there would be, just because a government will not want to place creditor interest over and beyond that of its citizens ordinarily. So unless there's more context to that clause, and if that's really just the case, it's a very, very curious one that I have to look into. Thank you very much for raising it. Adja here has a point to make as well.
Okay, good afternoon. I think we have a similar situation in Nigeria. We call it, we say that debt service has a first-line charge. We call it first-line charge, meaning that before revenue that accrues to the government or the federation and the states, that is the subnationals, are divided or given to each of the entities, you deduct debt service first. This procedure, I'm going to talk about tomorrow by God's grace, is actually to protect the interest, our own interest, not just that of the creditor. It may be nice for the creditor to know, but for us, is to defend, in order for us not to enter into default, so that we don't default on loan because of what we had, the experience of the Paris Club debt that we had in the past. We now have to put this into our law to say that all loans, they have first-line charge. So we deduct loan debt service from the federation account before sharing.
Thank you very much, Adja, for adding. I know that, a lot of, when you see, that's why we have a lot of African countries, debt service to revenue ratio is quite high because there's an easy allocation first to debts before other things. Well, I wouldn't get into the economic metrics because I'm not an economist, and I will just focus on the law part of our conversation. But it's very interesting, and Adja already promised to talk about it tomorrow, so I'm sure that it makes for good listening time when she does. Thanks both for flagging. There's another clause here, but I'm not going to read this one. This is actually just the revised version of what we just saw. Yes, so putting it together, prior conditions to fulfill that the lender lends initially and on an ongoing basis, that's condition precedent. Representations, we already described this, and covenants, we already described this as well, chief of which being the negative pledge and the pari passu clause. Confidentiality. I assume that in one or two cases, we may have seen a confidentiality clause in a loan documentation, or sometimes even maybe not a bond indenture, mostly loan agreements. Now, effectively, what this clause aims to do is to prescribe the revealing of information concerning a debt to a third party. It's a very dangerous clause. and it's dangerous if it is not carefully worded. So key questions you want to have in mind when you come across a confidentiality clause, a clause that says you shall not inform another party concerning the matters disclosed under this loan agreement. You want to ask, does this clause allow me to comply with national laws and policies? A lot of our countries have not developed policies and strategy documents that effectively say you must disclose your debt exposure. You must disclose who you are owing, how much you are paying, when you are paying. Transparency has become the name of the game in sovereign finance. How does having a clause that completely prohibits disclosure enable you to comply with your laws and policies? Does this comply with international standards? That's a good question to ask. Is this going to restrict me? Now, this is extremely important if I need to restructure my debts. This is important because a lot of countries get to a point where they have to restructure debts. And we'll talk about debt restructuring tomorrow. And if you have a clause in your loan documentation that says you cannot reveal the terms of your contracts or of your agreements, how do you disclose to other creditors within a restructuring situation how much you are owing to a particular creditor? Because during the restructuring, all the cards are on the table. Everyone needs to know what everyone is being owed because everyone is going to take losses, or most lenders, save the preferred creditors for the most part, are likely to take losses. So if there's a particular creditor that has an agreement with you that says you cannot disclose, it makes restructuring difficult. And so in the definitions section that we described earlier this morning, I emphasized why we need to pay attention to definitions. And one definition you want to pay attention to is the meaning of confidential information. Importantly, any public information or publicly available information cannot be confidential information. If it's generally available to the public, your creditor cannot ask you to keep it confidential. Importantly, if it's information that has come into possession of the government prior to the agreement, it doesn't matter that it is confidential to the creditor, but the government knew about this information before the agreement was signed, that cannot be brought within the buckets of confidential information. You want to also define who your permitted recipients are. It's important that in the definition section you are indicating that certain individuals, you could say the Ministry of Finance, the Debt Management Office or Division, the Attorney General's Office, members or officers who work there are permitted recipients of confidential information. And therefore, any information that comes to the government means information that has reached either of people who work in these departments. And so you cannot be said to have breached confidential information because a junior economist in the Ministry of Finance saw it. And finally, if the information is independently developed, now this is quite contentious because how do you define independently developed? But if it's independently developed by the government, it should not be a confidential information. So say, for example, the government put statistics together, did some research, and came about a conclusion that happens to be something that the creditor thinks must not be disclosed. Well, so long as the government can prove its process that we came about this conclusion by our own independent observation and research on the issues, it can't be confidential information. So here is a sample clause. And this time around, we are going to a country. Could be your country. Guinea. I believe Guinea is a Guinea-Bissau. Is there someone from Guinea-Bissau who will be interested in giving us perspective on how they will deal with this confidentiality clause? I believe Guinea-Bissau is probably somewhere around there.
Bonjour tout le monde. Je ne suis pas sûr si la Guinée-Bissau est présente dans la salle. Nous, c'est Guinée tout court, donc Guinée-Conakry. Mais je ne suis pas très certain d'avoir demandé la parole.
Guinée-Conakry.
Ouais. Merci.
Okay, what we have on the list is Guinea-Bissau. My apologies. So if it's Guinea-Conakry, it should be amended on the agenda. But if you do have a perspective on the clause, it's very welcome.
Honnêtement, nous n'avions pas demandé la parole, mais je sais que nous avons eu dans le temps un problème par rapport aux clauses contractuelles, aux clauses confidentielles des accords. Une fois, nous avons eu à travailler avec un partenaire et les clauses confidentielles s'étaient retrouvées dans la presse. Ça a automatiquement fait réagir le pays. Je pense que c'est le partenaire qui avait partagé certaines clauses confidentielles et le pays était obligé de rappeler le partenaire à l'ordre et éventuellement demander à ce que l'accord soit annulé ou bien qu'on puisse surseoir aux négociations jusqu'à ce que le partenaire rentre encore une fois dans l'ordre. Je me rappelle d'un cas comme ça dans notre pays. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. That's interesting. So it was cancelled. So I think, from what I understand, they had a confidentiality clause and the agreement was cancelled until that was fixed or removed.
It's like the partner did not respect the confidentiality agreement. What we agreed on was found on the web, and we think that the partner disclosed it. So we called them to correct that misbehavior. Until that's done, we cannot go forward with the negotiation. That's what happened once in my country.
It's interesting. So in light of that, how would you change, or what changes would you make to this clause?
I think it's fine. It's well explained.
You are happy with the clause?
Yes, to me. I'm not a lawyer. It's not my domain, but I think it's interesting already.
No, it's fine. I mean, it could be fine. Does anyone disagree or agree that it's a good clause? There's a hand there from the Gambia, it seems.
From South Sudan.
South Sudan, yes.
Yeah, this clause, it is, if we read it literally, it will be unacceptable. But because if we read it literally, mean that we have to disclose the agreement assembly. And it clashes also with the principle of human rights. Because when you enter to the loan, you subjected the people of this country to this loan. For you must disclose it to the people. And other thing also, it clashes with principle of transparency. But what I understand here, it is meaning that the whole content of the agreement, you cannot give it to other party, so he can benefit from it. This is the little I get from that one.
It's very good, and I want to move forward because of time, and thank you because you're spot on. This clause first says you can't disclose to any third party. That's extremely dangerous. You can't disclose to your population. You can't disclose, it specifically says you cannot disclose to your advisors or even your lawyer. That is an extremely worrisome clause without the prior written consent of the lender. Could be fair, I wouldn't agree, but it could be fair if it says without the written consent of your lender, not unreasonably withheld. But this gives the lender absolute discretion to agree or to approve or disapprove who you can disclose to, even your lawyer. That should not ever be accepted. And then there's no exclusion of, regulations or pursuance to your laws. By your laws, you're supposed to disclose certain things or policies. You want to ensure that's reflected in the clause. So in English, and I will go to the French version, this is, so you can see I deleted including but not limited to advisors or legal counsel, and such consent not to be unreasonably withheld. And then notwithstanding the foregoing, the obligation not to disclose shall not apply in the event of a requirement of law or at request of a regulatory, parliamentary, or supervisory authority exercising its supervisory, examination, and or audit function that is not specific to the transaction. This way, if you need to disclose under your laws to your people, under your policies, to credit rating agencies, for instance, this allows you to do so. And here's the French version, so our French colleagues can also see what it looks like. Ça bon? Oui, ça bon. Okay. Okay, confidentiality. This is more confidentiality. I will send the slides over to you. We have to move forward. Yeah, so this was this restructuring point I made. You need to have this confidentiality clause amended so that in times of restructuring, you can restructure. This is the tricky part, and I would try and go over this as quick as possible. Events of default are simply the things that you can do as a sovereign that could land you in trouble with the lender. So they are all face smiling with you in the beginning, but this is the clause you want to pay attention to. What can the lender say or use as a basis to call for close of the agreement or to call for payment, immediate payment? You want to check if they are fair, if the events that are listed are fair. So I hope we understand. An event of default is an event that occurs that the lender predetermines. Based on their occurrence, they are entitled to call for the loan or to seek immediate repayment or to call for a breach of the agreement. So you want to ask these key questions. Will they result in hair-trigger defaults? So again, it's that whole point of minimis events. Something like you initiated a payment on Friday, and the deadline to pay a particular installment was, let's say, that week. And then you initiated on Friday, and then because of network failure, the payment didn't land until Monday. And because by your agreement, Saturday was the deadline, your lender says you are in default. That's hair-trigger defaults. It's technical defaults that should not hold sway. So examples, failure by the borrower to pay, any principal or interest. So these are some of the reasons why the lender could say you are in default. One important one is the one in bold, cross-default or acceleration. In simple terms, a cross-default is a default that happens in another agreement entirely. You have an agreement, we use our example in the morning of Chad and a bank, and Chad is trying to enter, and Chad is entering an agreement with another country, say China. And it so happens that Chad has defaulted or has breached a clause in its agreement with the bank. That agreement was entered 5 years ago. Based on that breach, the agreement with China is also automatically in default. If you breach one agreement, you've breached all. That's the meaning of a cross default. So your default crosses over all your agreements. You definitely don't want that. And this is one of the friendliest terms that creditors would always put forward. And so how do we deal with this? This is just a definition of cross default. We deal with cross defaults by including cross acceleration. Remember, for most creditors, the reason why they feel confident to lend to you is because they are hopeful that they will get their money's worth as agreed. And so when you default on one of your loans, the message it sends to the market is that you don't have the liquidity or the capability to finance your needs. And so by implication, they expect perhaps that you will default on their own loans as well. And that's why this clause is relevant and extremely important to creditors. So instead of a cross-default clause, as lawyers would change that to cross-acceleration. And cross-acceleration means if one lender accelerates, and by accelerate is the technical term to mean if one lender sues or takes action in pursuance or in furtherance of reclaiming its loan, then it becomes a problem for your own loan. If the lender in the other agreement that there's a breach does nothing, nothing happens to you. Another thing to think about is to impute grace periods or cure periods. And so you can have a proviso in that clause that says a cross default has happened and it can only be triggered when a lender in the other agreement accelerates, provided a 30-day, which is a standard, a 30-day grace period is allowed for you. In fact, a 30-day grace period prior to written notice from the lender seeking repayment before the clause will be activated. So you change to cross-accelerate, and then you insist on a 1 month notice period for you to at least try to cure the default before it becomes an event of default. So I did a slide here just to explain it a bit more for you. And I showed you how to negotiate. Use cross-acceleration instead. Insert thresholds. That's very important. So you say cross-default if the loan that you defaulted on is to this amount. If it's a de minimis amount, a small amount, it shouldn't trigger cross-default. Grace and cure coordination, carve out disputed debt. One thing you want to indicate also is if on that loan that you defaulted on, that you had a breach on, if you are suing the lender and saying we disagree with your assessments, that should not trigger a default on another loan because it's subject to adjudication. General tips, I think we've talked about all of this. I don't want to belabor the points. This is a deep dive on default. This is what it looks like. We had what it looks like in a sophisticated, and I think I put complicated cross-default clause on the heading there, but you could also see simpler cross-default clauses, and that's this one here. It's a simple cross-default clause. And how do you negotiate it? You add all of this language. A principal amount exceeding the materiality threshold beyond the applicable grace period, which can be defined in the definitions. You have a clause in the definition saying grace period means 30 days under this agreement. And such failure results in acceleration of such external indebtedness by the applicable creditor. Another example is here. You will get the slides, and this is how you revise it. Sovereign immunity, this is where we draw the curtains. So generally, a sovereign cannot be sued, generally. Commercial transactions do not fall under the general rule. So the moment a creditor, a sovereign decides to enter into a commercial transaction, generally, it has waived the sovereign immunity, but you must include a sovereign immunity waiver in the agreement because your creditors will insist. We know that because you're already engaged in commercial activity, the law expects or supposes that you've waived your immunity, but we insist that you waive it expressly. And it's fine to waive it because if you don't waive it, what you're telling the creditors is that they cannot enforce against you, and no creditor will give you money if they know they can't get the money back or they can't force the money out of you. And so it's codified in the FSIA in the US, and there are exceptions to immunity, sovereign immunity, and that includes when you consent or when you enter a commercial capacity. We already discussed this. This is a sample clause. You can see very well articulated because your creditors don't play with this one. This is the one that says they can come after your assets if you don't pay. If an event of default happens, they can come after your asset because of this clause. And one thing you want to include in this clause is to say to the extent permitted by law. So our immunity is waived so long as our laws permit it. And no creditor would insist that you act illegally. So if you say, the law says, once you put to the extent permitted by law, creditors generally are then bound, because they can't really say, no, be illegal, go against your law. This is the French version. That's long, but you see, the good thing is that you'll get the slides. Key negotiation tips. So it has that long provision, but you want to ensure that you carve out a few things. The assets in your country. There's a chance that the creditors will refuse because they want to go after your assets, but it's worth trying. But definitely you want to ensure that diplomatic premises or property is not part of the stuff, it's part of the assets that can be acted upon or pursued. Central bank assets and reserve, very important, as I noted there, they're often given special status by law, by international law. Same with diplomatic premises. A diplomatic premise is an extension of a country. You cannot enforce against a country in that way. I'll just put it that way. Military assets, you can say for security reasons, you cannot go against or enforce against our military assets. And I will just move from there. I think when I want to really, so let me just focus on the nuance. The nuance is the clause also mentions we waive iniquity, we waive immunity to the extent permitted by law. That means if for law or international law, I already made this point. There's no need to belabor these points. You can see the case in the slide and you'll get the slide after. So I told you about the exceptions. You can put language like this. So when you see that long provision, you put an exception or a proviso, as we call it in law, that except that the borrower does not waive immunity with respect to all of this. So assets used for public purposes. Central bank, we've already discussed this. Governing law and jurisdiction, I will not belabor this point. The point here is creditors care about what country's laws apply to your debts and where they can enforce, what country has the jurisdiction to hear a case or arbitration if it comes to that. And so there's really nothing much you can do here. Because for international loans where the creditor is from another country, they may first insist to have their country's laws and country jurisdiction as the appropriate forum and laws to apply to your loan. You must push back on that. And then they will likely, very likely, not agree to your own local laws because Greece has given the world a very strong deterrent that if push comes to shove, they can change their laws and effectively stifle payments. The notes are in the slides, shouldn't be, oh, there it is. So that's the last thing here. Okay. We don't have any questions, I'm sure. No questions? There's a question? Okay, there are two questions. Okay, we'll take two questions because of time.
Merci, Monsieur Ogia. Je commence par remercier la commission d'organisation par rapport à cette conférence internationale. Je suis très heureux, je m'appelle Honorable Abdine Koumaré. Je suis le vice-président de la Commission des finances et de l'économie du Conseil national de transition du Mali, un pays membre de l'AES. Je suis heureux d'être là cet après-midi parce que j'ai appris pas mal de choses. Je ne suis pas un acteur direct de la gestion de la dette publique. Mais à ma qualité de membre de l'organe législatif de la transition au Mali et ancien président de la Commission des finances de l'Assemblée nationale du Mali de 2014 à 2020, j'ai un regard pointu sur la gestion pendant les deux périodes. Autrement dit, au niveau du pays en tant que pays institutionnellement élu et en tant que membre du Conseil national de transition dans une institution exceptionnelle qui gère les affaires dans cette période exceptionnelle qui est la transition. J'ai compris qu'il faut préalablement la volonté politique manifeste des plus hautes autorités pour avoir un système d'endettement positif. Je dis cela parce qu'au Mali, déjà en 2008, par rapport aux mesures d'accompagnement de la gestion de la dette publique, nous avons eu à prendre beaucoup de mesures, notamment par l'insistance du Fonds monétaire international. Nous avons eu à mettre en place un plan d'action gouvernemental pour l'amélioration et la modernisation de la gestion des finances publiques. Cela devait accompagner la gestion de la dette publique. Mais avec l'avènement du Conseil national de transition issu de cette transition que nous vivons toujours, je suis obligé de vous donner la genèse parce que, comme je vous l'ai dit, je ne suis pas un acteur direct de la gestion de la dette publique, mais j'ai des exemples qui vont prouver que c'est de par la volonté politique qu'on peut arriver à un résultat positif. Donc je disais qu'avec l'avènement de la transition, nous avons demandé déjà au gouvernement d'accompagner la loi de finances N+1 par un document de stratégie d'endettement. Ça, c'est déjà quelque chose de nouveau.
Please, sir, could you round off so that other people can have an opportunity to speak as well?
Oui, je crois qu'in fine, la question que je vais poser va s'adresser à M. Odia et à M. Pognon, en ce qui concerne leur intervention sur un point. Donc, je vais essayer de raccourcir un peu mes propos. Je dirais que au cours de cette transition, nous avons eu à prendre beaucoup de réformes, notamment les réformes fiscales, qui nous ont permis d'alléger notre système d'endettement. Et par rapport à ces réformes fiscales, tout ce que je viens de dire concerne les trois États de l'AES, c'est-à-dire le Mali, le Burkina et le Niger. Nous avons eu à prendre des mesures substantielles dans le cadre de la gestion des ressources minières. Et pour cela, je pose la question à M. Odia, est-ce que ALSF peut intervenir dans le cadre d'un contentieux?
Sorry, go on. I think my stop just tripped off. Please continue,
voilà,
monsieur.
Donc je disais que dans le cadre de nos réformes fiscales, nous avons eu à créer un code minier et le contenu local. Et nous avons créé une société nationale pour gérer nos ressources minières qu'on appelle Soroma SA. Et dans ce cadre-là, aujourd'hui, nous sommes en porte-à-faux avec Barrick. Est-ce que ALSF peut intervenir dans ce cadre par rapport à la gestion de ce dossier contentieux? La seconde question, je vais prendre le cas de la RDC, mais avec un autre regard. En 2008, la RDC signait un contrat chinois, échange de cobalt et cuivre contre routes et hôpitaux pour un montant total de 6 milliards de dollars. Ce contrat dit SICOMINE, c'est la dénomination du contrat, dit SICOMINE, a été largement critiqué pour son manque de transparence et l'absence d'obligations fermes de livraison d'infrastructures. Dans un rapport de l'Inspection générale des finances de la RDC en 2023, la Chine aurait investi à peine 822 millions de dollars en infrastructures au cours des 15 années suivant la signature, alors que les revenus des minerais dépassaient 3,5 milliards de dollars. Les entreprises congolaises, elles, ont été presque totalement exclues de la chaîne de valeur. En 2023, un jeune président, Tshisekedi, a exigé la renégociation du contrat, réclamant un meilleur partage du revenu, passage des redevances de 0,3% à 1,2%, plus le contenu local et une transparence accrue. Cette décision a été saluée par la Banque africaine de développement, la BAD, comme un exemple de souveraineté économique assumée. Est-ce que ALSF a intervenu dans la gestion de ce dossier avec l'esprit de la politique de gestion, et est-ce qu'il y a eu ce soutien juridique par rapport à la gestion de ce dossier? Voilà ma seconde question. Merci.
To what extent are they legal questions is an open question. But here's what I would say. To the first question about if the ALSF can intervene, again, as our director said yesterday, Mr. Pongland, that the way we work is when we receive a request from the government concerning a legal issue that they are facing. And sometimes it could be a financial issue if it's within the sovereign finance landscape. The ALSF is extremely happy to assist from that perspective. We are not able to delve into questions that are political or activist in nature. Our mandate is to equip African governments with legal supports to negotiate complex sovereign commercial transactions. So I don't know if that brings some perspective to the question you asked about how we can intervene given the context you provided. But I hope it brings some color. On the second question about the transaction with the DRC and whether the ALSF was involved, I think it would be helpful if we can have a bilateral conversation, because from where I stand, I don't remember or I have not seen that we were involved directly in that agreement or arrangement. So perhaps if we could talk maybe later, just in the interest of time for other people, to discuss the niceties of what really transpired. We are really far behind time, and we have one more session. So to give context, the aim of this discussion is we've talked about how to negotiate loan documents. One thing that is important that I must underline with loan documents is to begin to anticipate the global changes that are just beyond our ken, are just over the landscape of our human capacities. One of such, as we saw 4 years ago, was COVID. But that was just one. We've seen cyclone, I think there's a cyclone Idai in, was it Malawi or Zimbabwe? There were the droughts in South Africa, in Namibia, a couple of southern African countries, including Nigeria. There was a lot of flooding in Nigeria and South Africa, I believe. And Morocco, was it droughts or flooding? Droughts, yes. So there's been all of these issues that effectively invite sovereigns to redirect their resources from debt service to humanitarian assistance. You have a loan contract or a bond indenture that you are due on, but suddenly a huge pandemic happens. And now people need palliatives, people need resource centers. What do you do with your existing loan documentation? How do you not fall into default or distress based on this event? That's the whole point of what this session is about. So in the next 50 minutes or so, I'll try to run through the slides and give you a sense of how we can handle these situations, how countries began to react to COVID, how the seeds, small island developing states in Latin America are reacting, those ones that are particularly prone to natural disasters like hurricanes, like earthquakes, how are they reacting? And so that's the whole point. So you see that in 2019, 2020, 2021, we had COVID that disrupted revenue distribution. And not just in Africa, but across the world. Argentina had 18 billion funds reinjected to them by the IMF as part of their COVID funds, quite frankly. Same with the US. I mean, many countries, you know this. The Ukraine war has caused spikes. Okay, there's a question. But do you mind if we come to the questions later so I can just quickly run through all of this? So I have the other pop quiz here for the audience. Which of these 4 shocks do you think affected you the most? Somalia, which of these shocks was the most threatening for your country? Was it COVID or just the global monetary tightening more generally, or climate change and natural disasters? Which has been the most? Oh, Eritrea, do you want to give us a sense? Can we get a microphone to the representative from Eritrea? In one sentence, which of these 4?
COVID-19.
COVID-19 was the most?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. And so how do we build resilience into debt documents? In addition to negotiating for fits for purpose contracts, we discussed that already this morning or afternoon, you want to include pause clauses. Now, what are pause clauses? As you see on the screen, pause clauses allow you to pause your payments in your debt contracts when something concrete has happened and for a defined period. So you could say for the next, when you have a concretely determined natural disaster or pandemic, after that has been verified, for 2 years, you don't have to service your debts. Now, you can build that term into your contracts before it becomes an issue. That's the point of this. You can have modification clauses in your contract. You see, the good thing about entering into agreements, and this is where African countries can gain a lot of advantage, is just realizing that whatever is agreed to can be enforced. The problem arises when you agree to what you're not familiar with or when you don't include what is important for you. And so you can always include modification clauses, clauses that allow you, a clause that says, notwithstanding anything to the contrary as contained in these agreements, the borrower or the lender may initiate an amendment of consequential changes in these agreements in the event XYZ occurs. And then you want to also remove obstructive term. Any term that says, that makes it difficult to undertake debt restructuring. We talked about one of those terms, and that was what? Confidentiality terms. That would not allow you to disclose your debts, thereby stifling the possibility of restructuring. And so what do you gain by having pause clauses? Well, you receive fiscal breathing room for those 2 years that you have. Is that a question?
Bonjour à tous. Je voudrais juste poser une question par rapport aux questions soulevées. Par rapport, par exemple, nous, dans notre pays ou dans notre zone, au niveau de pratiquement la zone du Liptako, on traverse une situation d'insécurité, du terrorisme, qui n'est pas, si vous voulez, une situation traversée par tous les pays du monde, parce que vous parlez de la pandémie, vous parlez des crises qui touchent, si vous voulez, pratiquement tous les pays du monde. Mais là, c'est spécifique à une zone bien donnée. Par exemple, pour les 3 pays de l'AES, comme il l'avait évoqué, ou pour tous les 3 pays, le Niger, le Burkina et le Mali, traversent une situation d'insécurité. Est-ce que dans les clauses des contrats, on peut introduire le fait que lorsque la situation se détériore du jour au jour, qu'on pourra arrêter le paiement des services de la dette? C'est ce que je voulais savoir. Merci.
For the question, but please can we try to just jot down your questions because of time. I know this is a very important session, but just time is just not our friend, unfortunately. But please just jot your questions and I will take them at the end, so long as Mr. Chidi allows me. If he doesn't allow me, then we can all gang up against him and say, you must allow us to ask our questions. Okay, to your question, one of the criteria or one of the grounds for pause clauses, or any of these clauses, is humanitarian crisis. And I must say that even if war is perhaps signature to a couple of countries, it does not mean that this clause only applies to countries where the disaster is worldwide. I'll give you an example. Barbados, Jamaica, and Grenada, these are Latin American states. All of them have had to deal with one natural disaster, one earthquake. Perhaps most people here have not experienced earthquakes in their countries. There may be exceptions, but I think the majority of us in this continent have not experienced earthquakes in our lifetime, in our countries. But a person in Jamaica cannot make the same claim. But guess what? These clauses became popular by virtue of the claims of people who were prone to having hurricanes, which you don't have in Africa as much, I suppose. I don't know if there is, but I've not heard of. Or earthquakes, which is not prevalent in Africa. So the fact that Africa's disaster, in quotes, is not what has been put on the screen does not remove Africa from the possibility of laying claim to these clauses. Does that help? Yeah, so humanitarian crisis qualify. But again, it's subject to agreement with your creditors, as always. Oh, I actually put it there on the screen, didn't I? It's worth noting that debt clauses are no longer okay. Actually, in 2024, both Grenada and St. Vincent and the Grenadines triggered their clauses after Hurricane Beryl happened in those countries. So you see, a hurricane that happened in some countries triggered the clauses, but those countries don't have, and not in Africa. And we did not witness what they witnessed in Africa. So benefits, why do the creditors want this? They don't really want this, but it's also beneficial for them, and they've seen how beneficial it is for them. Because when you pause your payments, it means that you are opening yourself up to be able to pay later under predefined conditions. So it benefits them from that perspective. History of pause clauses. So first time was Grenada in 2015. They tried to trigger it. There was there's ICMA, there's Barbados, there's ICMA model law. This is just a history of what has happened so far in the space. So it's not a theory. Countries are actively using this to their advantages. So how do they work? Well, first, they work by trigger, a suspension period, and repayment terms. And what does this mean? The trigger the clause must have a predefined event that allows the borrower to activate or request the pause. So in your loan documentation, in your pause clause, you have to have agreed to an event. Say, for example, a war breaks out in a significant part of the country. That's a trigger event that would allow the government to then say, you know what, we cannot pay our loans for the next 2 years, pause, without penalty, pause. So triggers are typically based on hard, or what we call in jargon, parametric criteria. And that is an objective, measurable criteria. And what that typically looks like in practice is that you say, and this happens with Barbados, for instance, when X happens to you at this level, so when the flooding has gotten to XYZ, the amount of, I don't know what the numerical value that they use in, or term they use in defining the value, but anyway, the point is when there's been a certain scientific or physical threshold has been met. If your agreement contains that kind of trigger, we say you have a parametric criteria, something that is hard, that is objective, that is measurable. And so you see, I wrote an FYI here that the World Bank in 2024 broadened its pause clause to include a wider set of disasters that includes drought and health emergency, moving beyond strict parametric triggers, because the World Bank used to be very strict on measurable. It has to happen that we can see what happened, we can measure what happened, and then you can trigger. But now they're becoming more lax and allowing different kinds of possibilities. We have soft or proxy triggers, and these are the ones where when the government simply declares, oh, we have a pandemic, that's a trigger. Of course, as I'm sure you are understanding by now, no creditor will want you to rely on simply a declaration, because they may think that the government can declare anything to be a pandemic. So they will rather go for something that is objective and just measurable. I already answered the question. So there's hybrid where they mix both, where they have the combination of something measurable and objective. Say, for example, if 10, this is the wrong term, but I just don't remember the actual term. Let's just say 10 kilowatts of rain. That's very wrong. But assume kilowatts is the right measuring tool. 10 kilowatts of rain has fallen, and the government has declared that it's a flooding issue. That is a hybrid. If the clause just simply says once 10 kilowatts of rain has fallen, that's a flood, that's enough trigger for the first criteria, which is parametric or hard criteria. If the clause says once the government pronounces that there's a flooding, that's sufficient, then that's a soft criteria. And if the clause says when both the 10 kilowatts of rain has been objectively measured and the government pronounces, then that's hybrid. And I'm sure you know that creditors, of course, would favor the hybrid. So climate resilient debt clauses, this is popular in Latin America because they are the ones constantly facing earthquakes or flooding. That also happens, quite frankly, everywhere in the world. But theirs is more recurring. Theirs is more instant, I suppose, as well as hurricanes and earthquakes. So Grenada, Barbados, so CCRIF is an independent insurer that advances money to a country when they have, when a trigger has been met. And so what happens here is that once CCRIF has advanced money to a country, it's a hard trigger because it means that something that we can measure. We have seen that these insurers have advanced money. That means something has happened that we can measure, that is physical. And so when Grenada and Barbados relied on this, they were able to activate debt pause clauses on the basis of the fact that a hard trigger had been met. Obviously, they also added declarations by their governments, etc. The ICMA has a model on how pause clauses or how the triggers can work as well. So a growing aspect of debt clauses or climate resilience debt clauses are pandemic clauses. Prior to COVID, there was no pandemic clause because the last global pandemic, I believe, was it the Black Plague or the Great Plague? Was it Great Plague? And so none of us, I suppose, alive today had probably experienced, or perhaps they have, I don't know. Anyway, there was no need to have pandemic clauses until COVID, and now it's a new innovation post-COVID, even though it's not as popular as the general pause clauses that requires observable and measurable triggers. So the suspension period, so how long can you pause your loan service obligations? Well, what we are seeing, different organizations, the African Development Bank, I believe, has 6 months, I suppose. The World Bank has what they call a WAM, a weighted average maturity date. Barbados was able to defer for 2 years, but what we're saying in practice is usually 2 years. Lenders are okay with 2 years, so don't negotiate anything below 2 years. And if you get 3 years, that's perfect. What it just means effectively is that you don't have to service your debts as far as that contract is concerned for those 3 years. That's the idea of suspension period. This just gives you, so the AFDB, the ARBD, the World Bank, they enable suspension periods of 2 years. I think I said 36 months for AFDB. That's wrong, it's 2 years. And the UKEF has 1 year with an additional 1 year grace period. So you may be wondering, and it's good to wonder, what happens after the 3 years has passed or the 2 years has passed? So the thing about a pause is that unlike in English language, when you hear a pause, you hear finality. But in sovereign finance or sovereign debts, when you hear a pause or a pause clause, you hear, think about a comma. A comma in writing. It is wait until. And so you have to keep in mind when activating the pause clause that after 2 years, you still have that debt to pay. And perhaps, as in most cases, the debt will now be prorated. And so what you have to pay for the remainder of your debt term will be higher. Right? And so the reason why this is important to underline is so that debt managers, ministries of finance are careful to activate the debt plus. You have to think about the need or the balancing between the need for immediate fiscal breathing room and future payment responsibilities. Extremely important. We'll come back to this point a bit more later. So what are the post-resumption repayment structures? For Grenada and Barbados, what happened in those cases, and these are 2 cases that have actually successfully activated pause clauses in their loan contracts. What happened after they finished, or after the suspension period was over? The deferred interest was capitalized into principal. Remaining principal amortizations increased pro rata, like I just said. Right? And then for ICMA, CRDC provides, ICMA is the International Capital Market Association, as I'm sure you know, provides options. So deferred amounts could be capitalized and repaid over a set period of time, pro rata, or during the life of the debts at maturity. So under ICMA rules, the debt that now remains after the suspension period can be prorated, or you can wait and pay all at once at the end, a bullet payment. Right, Rabi? It's bullets. And the World Bank also allows the borrower to restart payments of the deferred amounts according to a modified amortization schedule that maintains the original weighted maturity of the loan. So what this means, in my understanding as a lawyer, I've seen that World Bank has what they call a weighted average maturity. And so when a loan is supposed to mature, they are able to extend for another 2 to 3 years or more in a way that does not overly extend the term of the loan and in a way that does not overtly impact negatively the borrower. So, yes, you're probably wondering, if we include debt pricing or debt pause clauses, would that not make our creditors want to impact how much you pay back? Would that not impact the premium on the loan or the interest on the loan? It's a good question. And it's a good question because first you have to understand the creditor is taking a risk that by acknowledging a debt pause, you are saying to them that there's a chance that you might have an earthquake and you have to pause your payments. There's a chance you might have domestic instability like a war and you might have to pause your payments. And so they may ask for a risk premium. But we don't have sufficient examples. This didn't happen in Barbados or Grenada who have successfully triggered the debt pause clause. So we don't have sufficient data to come to a conclusion as to whether it will actually impact pricing. But as a lawyer, I would advise that you should anticipate the possibility because you are telling the creditor your loan may be extended far beyond, or it may be paid in not so regular terms as agreed. Yeah, so that's what's on the screen, and you'll get the slides. So how do you balance this potential premium cost or risk? Well, you can argue that the reason why you have this clause is not to default, but if anything, it is to preserve the possibility of payment. And so even if it looks like you might default or you might pause, not default, you might pause, it's so that you'll be able to actually pay back. And so on that basis, your risk premium should be reasonable. Existing debt pricing already reflecting climate risk. So if, for example, you already have another arrangement with another lender that has a debt pause clause, you can use the benchmark, the interest rates in that one as a benchmark to say, you shouldn't, this is absurd, you shouldn't go beyond these particular interest rates. And if you use standardized documentation like the ICMA model documentation for debt clauses or debt pauses, that could also help you absorb high pricing for your loans. Impact on ratings. In short, I will just say this. As of last week, Fitch released, I'm sure you know Fitch released a new documentation just talking about the Barbados triggering of the debt pause clause. And it says, you know what, I want to read out exactly what Fitch thinks is a good criteria. It says, so long as the deferral clauses have been triggered by a predefined event and there's no haircut of the principal value and deferred payments continue to accrue their normal interest and the final maturity must not be materially, remember the word materially extended. So it could be extended but not materially. If these four factors are in place, Fitch says we would not reduce your credit rating just because you paused your debts. Because a debt pause clause is not a default, it's a pause. It is only when something dramatic happens after you pause. For example, you're unable to pay when you're supposed to resume payments, or you extend the maturity beyond reasonably acceptable, then that might impact, that could be a signal of insolvency or loss of liquidity and could impact credit ratings. But ordinarily, it doesn't and it shouldn't. You might be wondering, how does this compare with force majeure? I have all of this here in the, what is it called, in the slide. What's important to note is that the purpose of force majeure is to excuse a party's performance due to unforeseen, uncontrollable events. But a pause clause provides only payment relief for a predefined time. So it is not a force majeure clause. It is not saying, because under force majeure, you can argue that you've lost complete and total capability to pay. But with pause clauses, it's not supposed to absolve you of repayment. It's supposed to pause payment until you feel capable to resume payment. That's one of the biggest differences, but the rest of the differences are included in the slides that you will get. More differences. And just to note that there are certain enforceabilities. So courts interpret force majeure strictly, focusing on the contract wording and whether the event truly made performance impossible. So when you include a force majeure clause, what you're saying is you are giving your faith to the courts to determine if an actual force majeure event has occurred. But if it is for pause clause, it's enforceable as a contractual provision and as best practice. And again, you can see that enforceability depends on states. There are certain states that don't recognize force majeure because it's a UK or English law doctrine. Collective action clauses and majority voting provisions. These are other types of clauses that should be.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make reference to the previous slide. Maybe if you can go to the other one. The one on the, okay, yeah. You see just to give an example of the pauses, this CRDC, Climate Resilience Debt Clause. So it relates to the survey which we sent to your debt managers to complete. So I think you can relate to what is being discussed here as a pause clause. So what that survey is asking is whether you have utilized those pause, that CRDC pause clause in your debt contracts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sedwell. And yes. So, but I'm almost done. So, apart from the pause clauses, we also have what we call collective action clauses and majority voting provision clauses. In brief, collective action clauses are clauses you find mostly in bond indentures. And what they do is that they take care of what we call the holdout problem. You see, in 2014, Greece was undergoing what can be well described as one of the biggest Eurozone debt restructurings. And a lot of Greek or Greece bondholders refused to participate in the debt restructuring. What did Greece do? Fortunately for Greece, I said this story 2 days ago, because the bonds were governed by Greece law, domestic law. Greece changed the law to say everyone must abide by what we call a collective action clause. And effectively, a collective action clause is a clause that binds, where the majority of the bondholders bind the minority. Usually it is 75%. So once 75% of the bondholders agree, the decision is binding on all bondholders. This is very important for when you have to deal with a restructuring, and then there are certain creditors who are saying, we are not interested. Well, if you can get 75% of your bondholders to agree to your restructuring, the comments or the refusals or pushbacks by the other minority would not be binding on the sovereign. And it's the same thing for majority voting provisions. Oftentimes in loan documentation, you will see things like, and we saw that earlier today, you will see things like the borrower cannot do XYZ unless with the consent of all lenders, especially in a syndicated arrangement when we have several lenders. The best way to go around that is to convert all lenders to majority of the lenders, defined as 75% of the lenders. That will make consent process for lenders with lenders easier for the borrower to chew. Move forward, and these are just notes on how they play out in real life. You could get the slides later. Pause clauses compared to collective action clauses. Obviously, pause clauses are not collective action clauses. They are to pause the payment. Collective actions are to enforce the decisions of the majority lenders or bondholders over the minority who are dissenting. A lot of deep dives, you see, we just don't have time. This is quite something to do, but the slides will be made available to you. So this is how you amend. You can see the prior written consent. This is one of the examples of all lenders. And then when you change it, it's going to be, okay, this is another example of, okay, they actually give the revised clause, but the only thing that would change here would be the prior written consent of majority lenders. And majority lenders will be defined already in the definition section as 75% of the lenders. Okay, we are almost done. So you see, final observations or key takeaways. I would have asked what you have taken away from this session, but for want of time, I will just say some of them. The first is, to be truly impactful, pause clauses, CACs, and MVPs, that's majority voting provisions, should be incorporated into a significant portion of borrowers' debt agreements. Please look out for these clauses in your debt agreements. It's very important that you're there. Second, think carefully before you activate pause clauses. Sometimes, certain agreements, the lenders would only agree to one pause clause activation, and some are generous to accept 2 pause clauses. But when you activate it, remember that you are not stopping payments, you are deferring payments. You will still pay, and you may have to pay much later when you have more exposure or more debt servicing obligations in future. So pause clauses should not be viewed as a standalone solution. It should be taken as part of a robust disaster risk management framework. And good thing to note is that just last month, during the fourth I think it's FIFD conference, there was a reiteration of the calls for pause clauses and climate, what is it, CRDC? I can't talk anymore. Climate resilient debt clauses, yes, should be incorporated in debt agreements. I want to believe that's the last slide. Oh, I had a reflection for us. I'll let us read, and then if you have a question, please signify by raising your hand. Very interesting action point. It says, go home, open those loan documents and ask your lawyers, where is the resiliency in these clauses? Thank you, and may our nation stand as deeply rooted trees, unshaken by tomorrow's, I dare say, death storms.